3 million men, the greatest invasion force in human history. They called it Operation Barbarossa. They moved east in a storm of steel and confidence. They believed the war would be over before the leaves fell. The Germans laughed at first. They laughed at Russian roads. They laughed at Russian tanks. They laughed at Russian winter, until they saw it. The advance was spectacular. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Panzer divisions sliced through Soviet defenses. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. The world held its breath. The goal was the destruction of the Red Army, the capture of Moscow, the end of the Soviet Union. By August, they stood at Smolensk. The road to the capital lay open. It seemed inevitable, a matter of weeks. But then they stopped. Hitler looked south, to the wheat of Ukraine, to the oil of the Caucasus. The drive to Moscow was postponed. The generals protested. They begged for the final blow. But the Führer's will was law. His decision was final. My dear Elsa, the land here is endless. The dust gets in everything. We are driving the Bolsheviks before us like sheep. I expect to be home for Christmas. Save a bottle of wine for me. The mood was high. Victory was certain. Why would it not be? They were the masters of Europe. They had conquered France in 6 weeks. Russia would be no different. Or so they thought. Weeks turned to months. The precious summer was lost. The days grew shorter. The air grew cold. And then the rains came, the Rasputitsa, the time without roads. The earth dissolved into a bottomless sea of mud, a sticky, clinging mud that defied imagination. Everything stopped. The great German war machine ground to a halt. Trucks sank to their axles. Horses struggled and drowned in the mire. Men pushed and pulled their vehicles until they collapsed from exhaustion. The entire German advance was caught in a sticky brown glue. The mud clung to everything, to boots, to wheels, to hope. It was a preview, a warning of what was to come. The supply lines stretched to breaking point. Fuel ran low. Ammunition became scarce. The forward units were isolated, stranded in a vast ocean of mud. The laughter began to die, replaced by frustration and a growing unease. The first frost came in October, a hard blessing. The ground froze solid. The roads became passable again. The order was given. Operation Typhoon, the final assault on Moscow. The German army stirred itself from the mud and pushed forward one last time. There was a new desperation in the air, a frantic energy. They could see the spires of the Kremlin in their field glasses. They were so close, so very close. But now they faced a new enemy, a ruthless enemy who understood the cold. Fresh Siberian divisions arrived from the east. Their winter coats were white and thick. Their tanks started on the first try. Their rifles were designed for this weather. They were born to this land. They were prepared for its harshness. The German soldier shivered in his summer tunic. He looked at the well-equipped Siberian and felt a cold dread, not just from the weather, but from the realization that the enemy was ready. And he was not. Then the temperature plummeted. It was not just cold. It was a new kind of reality, a physical force that attacked without mercy. 30 degrees below zero, then 40, then 50. The Germans still wore their summer uniforms. Their threadbare greatcoats were useless. Their leather boots cracked open. Frostbite became an epidemic. Men would go to sleep and never wake up. Sentries were found frozen solid at their posts, still holding their rifles. The machine guns refused to fire. The oil in them turned to glue. Artillery shells lost their power. Tank tracks shattered on impact. The war of machines had become a war of survival, a primitive struggle against the elements. The cold was a sniper. It picked off men one by one. It did not miss. They laughed at the Russian winter until they saw it, and the winter showed no mercy. The wind was a razor cutting through the lines. It stole the warmth from your lungs. It whispered promises of sleep, an eternal sleep. Men stuffed newspaper into their uniforms. They stole rags from dead civilians. Anything for a layer of warmth. The horses. The beautiful horses of the Wehrmacht. They died by the thousands. Their carcasses became grim landmarks in the snow. Food supplies failed. Fuel convoys froze solid on the roads. Ammunition was rationed for the first time. A general wrote in his diary, "The strength of the army is bleeding away, not from enemy bullets, but from the cold. The cold is our greatest enemy. It is an enemy we cannot defeat." My dear Elsa, I can no longer feel my fingers to write properly. We have not received mail in weeks. The cold is everywhere. It is inside us. We burn everything we can find for warmth. Furniture from houses, fences. We even burn the bodies of the dead horses. The cold is a beast that eats you from the inside out. I do not think I will see you again. Tell Mother I love her. The men are silent now. No one laughs. We just stare into the snow and wait. We wait for the end, whatever that may be. December 5th, 1941. The temperature was 40 below zero. The German army was a ghost of itself. A frozen, bleeding ghost at the gates of Moscow. Then a low rumble began on the eastern horizon. It was not thunder. The Soviets had been waiting, building their strength. They chose this moment, the moment of maximum German weakness. With a scream of "Ura!" the Siberian divisions attacked. They came on skis. They wore white padded jackets. They were born for this war. The German lines shattered. There was no retreat, only a frozen route. Men stumbled back through the snow, leaving a trail of dead and dying. The myth of German invincibility was dead, killed by the Russian winter. They laughed at first. They laughed until the mud swallowed their ambition. They laughed until the cold cracked their steel. They laughed until the wind froze their laughter in their throats. Operation Barbarossa had failed, not by a single battle, but by 1,000 nights of frost, 1,000,000 falling snowflakes, an enemy that could not be defeated because it was the very air they breathed. The Germans laughed at the Russian winter until they saw it. And then they could only weep. The silence after the Soviet counteroffensive was profound. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of exhaustion, the silence of shock. The German line had not broken. It had shattered, like glass on stone. The retreat was not a tactical withdrawal. It was a desperate stumble westwards, away from Moscow, away from the freezing terror. Men abandoned their heavy weapons. They left behind artillery pieces, frozen solid to the ground. Tanks became icy tombs. Their fuel lines clogged their engines. Blocks cracked. The roads were littered with the debris of a broken dream. The wounded faced the worst fate. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. Men with terrible injuries lay on straw in unheated huts. Morphia froze. Antiseptics solidified. Surgeons operated with bare hands in temperatures so low that metal instruments would stick to skin. Amputations were performed without anesthesia. The piles of severed limbs outside the dressing stations were frozen into grotesque sculptures. Death was a release. My dear Elsa, I am writing this from a peasant hut. My feet are wrapped in rags. I cannot feel them. The man next to me died this morning. We cannot move him. He is frozen to the wall. We are waiting for a thaw to bury him. We are not soldiers anymore. We are survivors. We eat melted snow and a piece of hard bread. The Russians are everywhere. Their partisan dogs attack our supply sleds. I do not know if this letter will reach you. I hope it does not. I do not want you to see the words written by a ghost. The High Command far away in East Prussia issued orders. Stand fast. Hold the line. No retreat. These words on paper were a cruel joke to the men at the front. How do you hold a line when the ground is iron? How do you stand fast when you cannot feel your feet? How do you fight an enemy you cannot see through a blizzard? The disconnect between the reality of the front and the fantasy of headquarters was complete. It was a chasm filled with frozen bodies. The Russian winter was not a single event. It was a series of relentless assaults. The first snows of November, the deep freeze of December, the blizzards of January. Each wave was more punishing than the last. The wind was the true weapon. It found every gap in a man's clothing, every weakness in his spirit. It howled around their makeshift positions, a constant reminder of their insignificance. The land itself was their enemy, and the land was vast, and the land was cold. They had laughed at the Russian winter. They had called it a myth, a story told by cowards. Now they knew the truth. The winter was real. It was more formidable than any army. It did not need strategy. It did not need tanks. It simply was. And its sheer existence was enough to destroy them. Back in Germany, the propaganda machine tried to spin the disaster. They spoke of heroic endurance, of the bravery of the soldier facing the elements. They asked for winter clothing donations. The German people sent fur coats and woolen socks. A pathetic gesture, a drop of warmth in an ocean of ice. The packages arrived months later, if they arrived at all. Many were pilfered, many were lost. The men at the front received nothing. The psychological break was total. The confidence of the Blitzkrieg was gone. The belief in the Führer's infallibility was cracked. The men had seen the future, and the future was white and cold and endless. A deep fatalism set in. They called it the Russian look, a hollow-eyed stare of resignation, a man who has seen too much, who has felt too much cold, who has given up hope. The spring of 1942 brought a thaw. The snow melted to reveal the horror beneath. The landscape was a graveyard, the frozen dead now softened and bloated. The air thick with the smell of decay. The scale of the loss was finally visible. They had lost over 1 million men, not just to combat, to the cold, to disease, to despair. The mighty Army Group Center was a shadow. It licked its wounds and prepared for a new campaign. But the memory of the winter was a poison in its veins. The generals learned logistical lessons. They would never again begin a campaign so late in the year. They would stockpile winter fuel and lubricants. They would issue proper clothing. But these were technical fixes. They could not solve the deeper problem. The problem of space. The problem of distance. The problem of a country that swallowed armies. The Russian winter of 1941 became a ghost that haunted every German soldier for the rest of the war. Every autumn breeze brought a sense of dread. Every first snowfall triggered a deep-seated panic. They had faced the elemental power of nature and been found utterly wanting. Their technology, their discipline, their courage. It all meant nothing against 50 degrees of frost. The laughter was the most painful memory. The arrogant, foolish laughter of June. How could they have been so blind? How could they have been so proud? That laughter echoed in their nightmares. It was the sound of their own hubris, the sound of a paradise lost, the sound that preceded the fall. So we remember the winter, not as a season, but as a character in the war, a silent, brutal, and decisive general. It fought for Russia. It demoralized Germany. It changed the course of the world. The Germans laughed at first. They laughed until their teeth chattered. They laughed until their blood thickened. They laughed until the laughter died in their throats, frozen solid by the wind from the steppe. A wind that had blown for 1,000 years. A wind that would blow for 1,000 more. Long after the guns fell silent. Long after the empires turned to dust. The Russian winter remains. The legacy of that first winter shaped the remainder of the war. When the Germans launched their 1942 summer offensive, they moved south toward Stalingrad and the oil fields. They avoided the direct approach to Moscow. The memory of the previous winter dictated their strategy. They were like men afraid of a shadow, the shadow of the cold, the shadow of their own failure. And when the second Russian winter closed in around Stalingrad, it was the same story, the same frozen hell, the same desperate struggle against an invisible enemy. The Sixth Army was surrounded and destroyed, not just by Soviet tanks, but by the cold. The cold that froze their rations, the cold that immobilized their vehicles, the cold that killed their wounded. The pattern was set in 1941. It was repeated in 1942, and again in 1943. The German army could win battles in the summer, but it could not survive the Russian winter. The Russian soldier also changed. He saw the German invader broken by the cold. He saw the mighty Wehrmacht humbled by the snow. This gave him a fierce confidence, a deep connection to his land. He knew the winter was his ally. He knew the land would fight for him. This was a psychological advantage that could not be measured in divisions or tanks. It was a belief in the very soil beneath his feet. For the German soldier, Russia became a place of nightmares, a vast geographical trap. The further east they marched, the longer their supply lines became, the more vulnerable they were to the winter. They were conquerors who could not hold what they conquered. They were invaders who were being invaded by the climate itself. The home front felt the impact too. The letters from the east stopped being cheerful. They became short, desperate, filled with strange requests for wool and grease. Then they stopped coming altogether. The official telegrams arrived: killed in action, missing in action, died of frostbite. The words frostbite entered the German vocabulary with terrible frequency. A whole generation of young men was being consumed by the cold. The world watched and learned. Military strategists studied the Russian campaign. They saw the critical importance of logistics, the vital need for proper equipment, the absolute necessity of understanding the theater of war. The German failure became a textbook example of hubris, a warning to all future armies. Do not underestimate your enemy, and never, ever underestimate the weather. Today the battlefields are quiet. The forests have grown back over the trenches. The plows have turned the soil over the mass graves. But the winter still comes, just as cold, just as relentless. If you stand on those fields in January and listen to the wind, you can almost hear it. The echo of a million lost voices, the ghost of a broken army, the memory of a laughter that turned to silence. The lesson is simple. Nature does not care about your plans. The earth does not care about your ambitions. The winter will come regardless. The Germans learned this lesson at a terrible cost. They marched east as masters of the world. They staggered back as broken men, all because they laughed at a winter they did not understand. They laughed at a power they could not control. They laughed at a force that had been waiting for them since the beginning of time. So let the story be told. Let it be remembered, not just as history, but as a warning about arrogance, a warning about pride, a warning about the limits of human power. The Germans laughed at first, until they saw the Russian winter, and the winter saw them, and the winter did not laugh. The winter simply endured, and in the end, endurance was enough.